I caught her in the act at 6:12 a.m., standing on my lawn with a garbage bag and that tight-lipped look of righteous fury, holding one of my garden gnomes by the head like it was contraband, and in that exact second, I knew this story was either going to end with me losing something I loved, or with her learning a lesson she'd never forget. That gnome wasn't even offensive. It wore a tiny blue hat and held a sunflower butt to her. It was a crime against conformity, something she felt entitled to erase because it didn't fit her vision of a respectable HOA neighborhood. This wasn't the first time either. Over the past month, gnomes had vanished, cracked, reappeared broken, or been shoved face down into the dirt. And every time it happened, she'd smile that same tight smile over the fence and remind me this. Community had standards. She wasn't on the board, didn't hold a title, didn't pay my mortgage. But she acted like the self-appointed sheriff of joy, armed with printed bylaws and a highlighter. I confronted her once, calmly, asking if she'd touched my property. And she actually laughed and said, "If you don't want things messed with, don't put trash in your yard." That sentence burned itself into my brain. Those gnomes weren't trash. They were gifts from friends, silly little figures that made kids stop and smile, pieces of personality in a world obsessed with sameness. Toward that, the notes escalated anonymous, but unmistakably hers, warning me of formal complaints, documentation, and consequences. Even though I'd checked the bylaws twice, and nowhere did it ban garden statues. Still, she kept going, emboldened by the fact that most people quietly complied just to avoid her attention. And each broken gnome felt less like vandalism and more like a message. This neighborhood is mine to control. That morning when she froze and realized I was standing there recording, something shifted, not anger but clarity. She thought she was untouchable because no one ever challenged her, and she was wrong. If you've ever had a neighbor mess with your peace just because they could, if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen hiding behind rules to bully people into silence, you're going to want to hear how this plays out. So before I tell you what I did next, and how one unforgettable gnome finally stopped her for good, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because this is where the real neighborhood dramas, petty power trips, and perfectly earned lessons come to lighten. You won't want to miss what happened next. After that morning, the garden felt different, like it knew something was coming, and so did I. I stopped replacing the broken gnomes right away, not because I was giving up, but because I wanted to see how far she'd go when she thought she was winning. For a week, nothing happened, and I could almost feel her irritation growing. The way control freaks get restless when there's nothing left to control. Then the notes returned, longer this time, more detailed, taped directly to my front door instead of the mailbox, warning me that unsightly objects had been reported and that the HOA was monitoring the situation closely, even though no official HOA letter ever followed. She'd graduated from vandalism to intimidation, just trying to scare me into compliance without getting her own hands dirty, and honestly, it might have worked on someone else. But every note, every sideways look over the fence, every time I caught her photographing my yard with her phone, just added fuel to a very specific kind of determination. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, videos, even the exact wording of her notes, because bullies like her thrive on the assumption that no one's paying attention. Also started talking to neighbors, quietly at first, during evening walks or while grabbing mail. And it didn't take long to realize my gnome problem wasn't unique. She'd complained about wind chimes, porch flags, kids' chalk drawings on sidewalks, even a memorial bench someone installed for their late husband, all under the banner of community standards. Most people complied just to keep the peace, but the resentment was there, simmering under polite smiles. One neighbor admitted she'd thrown away decorations she'd loved just to avoid becoming the next target. And that's when this stopped being about gnomes for me and started being about something bigger. Meanwhile, my yard became suspiciously popular, with her lingering near the fence more often, pretending to pull weeds while clearly watching, waiting, probably hoping I'd put another gnome out so she could justify whatever she'd planned next. And then I had an idea, an impulsive, angry one, but a slow, deliberate plan that made me smile for the first time in weeks. If she was going to obsess over my garden, I was going to give her something she couldn't ignore, something that followed every rule while exposing exactly how ridiculous her crusade was. I reread the bylaws line by line, highlighting every vague phrase about decor, ornamental objects, and visual harmony, and nowhere did it limit size, quantity, or theme, just intent and placement. That loophole became my blueprint. I spent nights sketching designs, researching materials, even checking local zoning codes just to be sure, because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it clean. No violations, no gray areas, nothing she could touch without exposing herself. Completely. The next weekend, I started construction quietly, early mornings and late evenings, assembling something in my garage that looked innocent enough in pieces but would be impossible to miss once complete. She watched, of course, pretending not to care, while absolutely caring, her curiosity warring with her self-righteousness. And every time our eyes met over the fence, I gave her a polite nod that seemed to irritate her more than any argument ever could. I could feel the tension building like the calm before a storm, and I knew once this thing went into the garden, there'd be no going back, no pretending this was just a neighborly disagreement. If you think destroying a few ceramic gnomes was bold, wait until you hear what I built, why it was perfectly legal, and how it turned her own tactics against her, because that's when the story really starts to get interesting. By the time the structure was finished in my garage, I had memorized the HOA bylaws better than most of the board members probably ever had, not because I loved rules, but because I wanted to make absolutely sure there was nothing she could touch without exposing herself. Every measurement was intentional, every material chosen with compliance in mind, and every detail double-checked against the exact language she liked to weaponize. Early Saturday morning, before most of the neighborhood was awake, I rolled the final piece out onto the driveway and assembled it in the garden, right where the broken gnomes used to stand. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was a massive garden gnome, nearly 6 feet tall, handcrafted from weather-resistant material, painted in cheerful colors, smiling broadly, holding a tiny sign that read "Welcome" and placed firmly within my property line, exactly where decorative objects were allowed. From the street, it was impossible to miss. From her house, it was unavoidable. I stepped back, wiped the dirt from my hands, and felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind that comes when you know you've already won half the battle simply by refusing to be intimidated. She noticed within minutes. Her front door flew open, and she stood there staring, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. Her face cycling through disbelief, outrage, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. She marched over, stopped at the edge of my lawn like there was an invisible barrier, and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I smiled, politely, and told her it was a garden decoration, fully compliant with HOA rules, and that if she had concerns, she was welcome to file them through the proper channels. That sentence hit her harder than yelling ever could. She sputtered, accused me of mocking her, claimed it was an eyesore, a provocation, a violation of the spirit of the neighborhood, and I listened patiently before reminding her that only the written rules mattered, not personal taste. She stormed off without another word, phone already in her hand, and by that afternoon, HOA complaint she'd clearly been waiting to file finally arrived. This time it was official, complete, with formal language and a scheduled inspection, and for the first time since this all started, I welcomed it. The inspector arrived midweek, clipboard in hand, walked the property carefully, measured distances, took photos, and flipped through the bylaws while I stood quietly nearby. The giant gnome passed every single check. Height wasn't restricted. Placement was legal. Materials were approved. Theme wasn't regulated. The inspector even smiled, just briefly, before noting no violation found on the report. That should have been the end of it, but people like her don't give up easily when their sense of control is threatened. Instead of backing down, she escalated socially, complaining loudly to neighbors, framing me as disruptive, claiming I was lowering property values and antagonizing the community. The problem for her was that by then, people had seen the notes. The broken gnomes, the surveillance, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Instead of isolating me, She started isolating herself. Neighbors who'd once quietly complied began pushing back, asking for proof, questioning complaints, refusing to be shamed into silence. The giant gnome became a kind of unofficial landmark, a symbol that rules couldn't just be bent to suit one person's preferences. And every time she walked past it, visibly seething, it reinforced the lesson she'd never expected to learn. You can't bully someone who refuses to play along. But she still had one more move left, and when she tried it, it would backfire in a way she never saw coming. Her final move came wrapped in the kind of fake politeness that should have been a warning all on its own. Because one afternoon, a neatly printed letter appeared on my door, not handwritten this time, not anonymous, but officially branded with the HOA logo and filled with carefully chosen language about community, harmony, and ongoing disturbances. She had finally convinced the board to call a special meeting, framing the giant gnome not as a rule violation, but as intentional harassment, claiming it created a hostile environment and provoked conflict which would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so transparently manipulative. I showed up to that meeting prepared, binder in hand, timeline documented, photos printed, videos queued, and copies of every note she'd ever left me neatly organized, because bullies, like her, rely on emotion and volume, not evidence. She spoke first, of course, voice quivering just enough to suggest victimhood, describing my garden as chaotic, my gnomes as aggressive, the large one as a personal attack, insisting she felt unsafe in her own home because of it. Feel the room shifting as she talked, not toward sympathy, but toward discomfort, because the more she spoke, the more unreasonable she sounded. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice or insult her. I simply laid out the sequence of events, starting with the missing gnomes, then the broken ones, then the notes. Then the video of her standing on my lawn at dawn with a garbage bag in her hands. The room went very quiet after that. Bored. Member asked her directly if she'd ever touched my property. The pause before her answer said more than the words she chose. She denied it weakly, but by then, the narrative she'd tried to build had collapsed under its own weight. The HOA attorney reviewed the evidence, asked a few pointed questions, then did something I didn't expect, he reminded the board. That repeated interference with a neighbor's property could expose the association to liability if it appeared they'd ignored harassment complaints. Suddenly, this wasn't about gnomes at all. It was about risk, and risk is the one thing HOAs understand very clearly. The meeting ended with a formal warning issued not to me, but to her, stating that further interference or harassment would result in fines and possible legal action. And the irony of that moment was almost overwhelming. She left the room. Without making eye contact, her posture stiff, her authority evaporated, while neighbors who'd never spoken to me before gave quiet nods of support. In the days that followed, the transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Ouch. She stopped watching. My yard stopped photographing, stopped leaving notes, and most importantly, stopped touching anything that didn't belong to her. The giant gnome stayed right where it was, smiling benignly, completely legal and utterly untouchable. And over time, it stopped feeling like a provocation and started feeling like a monument. Not to pettiness, but to boundaries finally respected. Other neighbors began adding their own harmless decorations again, wind chimes returning, flags reappearing, chalk drawings blooming on sidewalks. And the neighborhood felt lighter, freer, less surveilled. I realized then that the gnome had done exactly what I'd hoped it would. Not by intimidating her, but by forcing everything into the open where manipulation couldn't survive. She had tried to use the system as a weapon, and instead, the system finally saw her clearly, and while she still lived next door, her power was gone. Reduced to quiet glances and carefully kept distance. The story could have ended there comfortably. But something interesting happens when control is stripped away from someone who's built their identity around it. What she did next would prove that the most lasting consequences aren't always imposed by rules, but by reputation. After the meeting, she became quieter than I'd ever seen her. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but hollow, like someone who's lost the only role they knew how to play. And while she never apologized, she didn't have to, because the neighborhood itself delivered the verdict she feared most. People stopped indulging her complaints, stopped nodding along when she muttered about standards, stopped giving her the attention that had once made her feel powerful and in a place. Like ours, that loss was devastating. The giant gnome stayed put, weathering sun and rain. A silent witness to the fact that intimidation only works until someone refuses to be intimidated. And slowly it stopped being my gnome and became part of the landscape. Something kids waved at, something visitors laughed about, something that reminded people of a moment when one person finally said no. She avoided my side of the fence entirely now, rerouting her walks, keeping her curtains closed. And the woman who once prowled the neighborhood looking for violations became someone people barely noticed at all. That, I realized, was the part she would remember forever, not the gnome itself, but the way her authority vanished the moment it was exposed to daylight. I still tend my garden the same way I always did. Still keep the repaired gnomes nestled around the big one like a joke only the garden understands. And every so often a neighbor will stop by and say something like, "You know, I finally put my decorations back up," or "I'm glad someone stood up to her." And each time I'm reminded how close I came to giving in just to keep the peace. Peace, I learned, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of fear. And fear only survives when everyone agrees not to challenge it. Looking back, I don't feel proud in a triumphant way, and I don't feel bitter either. I feel grounded. Like someone who learned that boundaries don't have to be loud to be firm, and that sometimes the most effective response to bullying is patience paired with preparation. The gnome wasn't revenge, it was a mirror, and once she was forced to see herself clearly, there was nothing left for her to argue with. If you're dealing with a neighbor who thinks rules give them the right to control you, remember this story. Remember that compliance is a choice. It's not an obligation, and that even the smallest joy is worth defending when someone tries to take it away. And if you want more real stories about everyday power trips, HOA nightmares, and the quiet ways ordinary people reclaim their space, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because these aren't just stories about neighbors, or gnomes, or rules. They're reminders that you don't have to live smaller just to make someone else feel bigger. And the next time someone tries to cross your line, you might just find your own unforgettable way to make sure they never do it again.